Have you ever wondered whether courage is simply choosing to walk where fear tells you not to? Welcome, my friend. I'm John, and I'm glad you've joined me beside the fire tonight. Beyond the mountains of Middle-earth, there are halls where time itself seems to linger, and old stone remembers footsteps long forgotten. Listen closely, for not every gate was built to keep treasure in, and not every silence is empty. Come with me now, and let the mountain tell its tale. The Fourth Age had settled gently upon the lands of the West, and the clang of war had given way to the steady rhythm of hammer upon stone. Beneath the towering walls of the Hornburg, where victory had once been won against impossible odds, another kingdom had quietly flourished. The glittering caves that had first stolen Gimli's heart now rang with the voices of his people, who shaped chambers of crystal and marble into halls worthy of the memory of Durin. Travelers from the realm of King Elisar often paused in wonder before the entrance, but few beyond the dwarves truly understood the greatness hidden beneath the mountain. Day after day, lamps of polished bronze cast warm light across pillars that shimmered with countless colors, and every new passage revealed another marvel patiently waiting within the living rock. To many, the caves were a treasure beyond price, yet to Gimli they were also a promise fulfilled, one made long ago to himself when he first walked those glittering halls beside old companions who had changed the fate of Middle-earth. Gimli had grown older, though age rested lightly upon one of Durin's folk. His beard had become streaked with silver, yet his arms remained broad, and his stride was as steady as it had been when he marched beneath the banners of the Fellowship. He often walked alone through the newest tunnels before the day's labor began, laying a calloused hand upon fresh-cut stone and listening to the quiet voice that every dwarf believed lived within the mountain. Sometimes younger craftsmen greeted him with respectful bows, but he rarely lingered for ceremony. "Good stone tells its own tale," he would say, while examining a wall for hidden flaws. The younger miners smiled whenever they heard those familiar words, for they had come to know that their lord trusted skill more than grand speeches. His gaze lingered upon every arch and every supporting pillar, measuring each with the practiced eye of one who had spent a lifetime beneath mountains. The settlement had grown far beyond the first chambers carved after the War of the Ring. Workshops echoed with the ringing of chisels, forges glowed red in carefully vented caverns, and storerooms overflowed with carved stone, polished gems, and finely worked metal destined for trade with Gondor and Rohan. Children laughed in broad galleries, where crystal ceilings reflected their voices like bird song, while elders gathered beside deep pools whose waters had flowed unseen since before the coming of men. Every corner carried the scent of clean stone, mixed with coal smoke and hot iron, a fragrance that no dwarf ever found unpleasant. The halls were orderly without feeling lifeless, busy without descending into chaos, and each family contributed to the growing strength of the colony. Gimli often paused simply to watch them at their work, for no victory in battle had ever pleased him more than seeing his people prosper in peace. Not all of the mountain had yet revealed its secrets. Beyond the settled chambers stretched countless passages, untouched by hammer or lantern, where only ancient streams whispered through narrow cracks beneath the earth. Surveyors mapped each new corridor with patient care, marking dangerous shafts and unstable ceilings before larger crews followed behind them. The work demanded discipline more than speed, because every experienced miner knew that pride could awaken disaster in the depths. There were tales handed down from Erebor and the iron hills of reckless delvers who had ignored the warnings written in the grain of stone. Gimli himself had lived through the long shadow cast by Khazad-dûm, and needed no reminder that mountains sometimes guarded memories best left undisturbed. Even so, the desire to uncover hidden beauty burned brightly in every dwarven heart. One cool morning, a master mason named Frar sought Gimli near the eastern workshops. Dust covered the old craftsman's beard almost to his belt, and his expression carried neither excitement nor fear, only the careful restraint of one who wished to speak plainly before drawing conclusions. "My lord," he said, removing his gloves with deliberate calm, "the Western crew has found something that does not answer our tools as ordinary stone should." Gimli studied the mason's weathered face before replying, for Frar was not a dwarf given to exaggeration. "A hard seam of granite?" he asked. Frar slowly shook his head. "No, it sounds hollow, yet the face is carved, and none among us remembers laying such work beneath these halls." Those words settled heavily between them, for every known chamber had been recorded since the colony's founding. Gimli wasted little time gathering a handful of trusted overseers before making his way toward the newest excavation. The route wound through unfinished corridors where fresh chisel marks still scarred pale limestone and piles of broken rock waited to be hauled away. Lantern flames flickered whenever cool drafts drifted through unseen cracks, carrying faint scents of damp earth untouched by forge smoke. The workers stood aside as their lord approached, their conversations fading into respectful silence. No panic lingered among them, yet curiosity had spread from one crew to another with remarkable speed. Every miner understood that unexpected stone beneath a mountain could lead either to fortune or to ruin, and wisdom demanded that neither possibility be ignored. The excavation itself lay at the end of a long gallery where the ceiling dipped lower than elsewhere in the caves. Fresh debris covered the ground, and heavy iron wedges remained embedded where the last blows had been struck. At first glance, Gimli saw only an uneven wall, darkened by centuries of moisture. But as he stepped closer, his sharp eyes distinguished lines far too straight to be natural. He brushed away loose dust with the back of his hand, revealing smooth stone beneath that bore neither the grain of the surrounding rock nor the familiar craftsmanship of his own people. The surface had been shaped with remarkable precision, yet its proportions felt subtly different from any dwarven doorway. He narrowed his eyes and traced one edge with careful fingers, saying nothing until he had followed the entire outline. The wall proved to be no wall at all. Buried within the mountain stood a pair of immense stone doors, fitted so perfectly together that only a hair-thin seam revealed where one ended and the other began. Around the edges ran faded carvings, almost erased by unimaginable years, their patterns unlike the angular runes cherished by Durin's folk. Some resembled twisting roots, while others curved like flowing water before vanishing into shapes no one present could name. Frar quietly observed, "Our chisels uncovered only the center. The rest was hidden behind untouched rock." Gimli gave a slow nod, and his thoughts reached backward through every tale he had learned in Erebor, searching for some forgotten memory that matched what now stood before him. The younger miners murmured among themselves, each offering guesses that grew more extravagant as they passed from beard to beard. One suggested that men of forgotten kingdoms had tunneled beneath the mountains before history began, while another whispered that wandering craftsmen from distant lands might have left hidden shrines beneath the White Mountains. An older foreman silenced them with a stern glance, reminding them that wild stories often outran truth. Gimli appreciated the rebuke, yet he admitted to himself that certainty escaped him as completely as it escaped the others. He had traveled farther than most living dwarves, and had seen the great halls of Erebor, the glittering caves, and even the silent ruins of Khazad-dûm. But this stone belonged to none of those traditions. Its maker remained hidden behind centuries of darkness. He ordered the workers to suspend all digging around the structure until it could be examined properly. The command disappointed several eager miners, yet none questioned it aloud, for Gimli's caution had preserved many lives over the years. Timber supports were strengthened, lanterns repositioned, and the loose rubble carefully removed from the base of the mysterious doorway. Every scrape of shovel against gravel echoed strangely through the chamber, as though unseen spaces waited beyond the sealed stone. More than once the workers paused, believing they had heard faint sounds beneath the mountain, but each time silence returned before anyone could identify their source. Gimli noticed the uneasy glances exchanged among even the most experienced miners, though no fear had yet taken hold. When the day's labor ended, the chamber emptied until only Gimli and Fra remained beside the ancient doors. The lamps cast long golden reflections across the polished surface, revealing details invisible beneath the harsher light of working lanterns. Tiny veins of pale crystal shimmered inside the carved stone itself, as though stars had been trapped beneath its face. Whoever made this wished it to endure, Fra murmured. Gimli rested both hands upon the cold surface and felt no movement, no hidden mechanism, only the deep stillness of something that had slept undisturbed through ages beyond counting. Yet somewhere beneath that silence, instinct whispered that the mountain was waiting. As they finally turned away, Gimli looked back one last time before extinguishing the last lamp. He could not explain why the discovery troubled him more than delighted him, for every dwarf lived to uncover forgotten wonders beneath the earth. Still, experience had taught him that ancient doors were built for reasons, and the oldest reasons were seldom simple. He remembered long roads through Moria, the echo of unseen footsteps, and the price paid whenever pride overcame caution. Those memories did not command him to abandon the mystery before him, but they urged patience where younger hearts hungered for swift answers. Above them, the halls of the glittering caves slept in peaceful confidence, unaware that behind a newly uncovered wall rested a secret that had endured since long before the kingdom, beneath Helm's Deep, had drawn its first breath. The following morning began no differently from any other within the glittering caves. Smiths kindled their forges before sunrise, bakers filled the galleries with the scent of fresh bread, and the first wagons rattled toward the upper entrance, where merchants from Rohan would arrive before midday. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of the settlement, word of the hidden doors had already spread farther than Gimli had intended. Miners spoke quietly, while sharpening picks. Guards exchanged curious glances at their posts, and apprentices invented impossible tales before breakfast was finished. Gimli noticed the restless mood as he crossed the central hall, and he regretted neither his caution nor his silence. A mountain could not be hurried, and neither could the truth buried inside it. By the second hour after dawn, the chamber beyond the western galleries held only a handful of trusted dwarves. Gimli had summoned Fra, the engineer Borin, 2 master stonecutters, and the colony's oldest rune-keeper, Fundin, whose memory stretched back through countless songs and family records. Fundin walked slowly with the help of an ash staff, polished smooth by decades of use, but his eyes remained keen despite the weight of years. He studied the stone without speaking, tracing the worn carvings with gloved fingertips that barely touched the surface. The silence lengthened until Borin finally shifted his weight and muttered, "Either the Old One knows something, or he has fallen asleep standing." Fundin answered without looking up. "If I had fallen asleep, I should still have more wisdom than impatient engineers. Wah! A ripple of quiet laughter eased the tension, though only for a moment. Fundin stepped back and drew a small notebook from beneath his heavy cloak, comparing the weathered patterns with sketches copied long ago from forgotten libraries in Erebor. He frowned once, then again, before slowly closing the book. "These are no runes of Durin," he said at last, "nor do they belong to the dwarves of the Blue Mountains or the Iron Hills. They resemble markings older than the kingdoms of men, yet they are not elvish either." Gimli folded his arms across his broad chest. "Can you read even a single sign?" Fundin shook his head. "No, but whoever carved them understood stone as deeply as any mason I have ever known." The answer satisfied no one. Borin knelt near the base of the doorway and examined the narrow seam where the two great slabs met. He tapped lightly with the wooden handle of his hammer, listening to each echo with practiced concentration. Some strikes returned the solid ring of dense stone, while others carried a strange hollow note that seemed to travel away into unseen depths. "There is empty space beyond," he announced quietly. "Not a narrow chamber. Something much larger." Fra frowned toward the darkness beyond the lantern light. "If that is true, these doors have stood between us and it for longer than memory." Gimli crouched beside the threshold, studying every inch of the frame. Dust had gathered inside tiny grooves that formed subtle patterns around the edges, and centuries of mineral deposits had nearly hidden several carefully shaped recesses. They were too regular to be accidents of nature. He brushed them clean with a stiff leather cloth until 6 shallow circles emerged from beneath the grime. Each circle bore faint scratches where something had once rested or turned. "A locking mechanism," Gimli murmured. "Not a simple one." Borin leaned closer, his curiosity overcoming his caution. "Can it still work after all this time?" Gimli answered honestly. "Stone remembers longer than flesh." The rest of the day passed in careful examination rather than excavation. Thin iron probes slipped into narrow cracks, measurements were copied onto parchment, and every visible carving was sketched by patient hands. No hammer struck the ancient doors without Gimli's permission, and no one attempted to force them open. Several younger miners watched from the edge of the chamber, disappointed by the slow pace, but wise enough not to interfere. Their whispers echoed faintly against the unfinished walls before disappearing into silence. Even the air felt different here. A cool draft flowed steadily from somewhere beyond the hidden seam, carrying the clean scent of untouched rock instead of the familiar warmth of inhabited halls. As the afternoon wore on, Fundin requested a brighter lamp and returned to the carvings. This time he ignored the larger patterns and focused upon tiny symbols scattered almost invisibly among them. Hours passed before he finally inhaled sharply. "These are not words," he said. "They are marks left by tools, almost like the signatures of craftsmen." Gimli stepped beside him, studying the shallow cuts that crossed one another beneath layers of age. They revealed no names, yet each mark differed slightly from the next, suggesting many hands had labored together upon the enormous gateway. "A great work," Fra observed softly. "Too great for a single builder." Fundin nodded. "And important enough that each wished to leave proof that he had shaped it." Ktor. The discovery deepened the mystery instead of solving it. Dwarves had always honored those who crafted enduring works, but this style belonged to no tradition anyone present recognized. Gimli found himself wondering what kind of people had once stood where he now stood, fitting these immense stones together with unmatched precision before vanishing from history. Had they lived beneath the White Mountains, or had they come from lands long swallowed by time. If they had built these gates to guard something, what purpose had demanded such effort? He disliked questions without answers. They reminded him too much of abandoned halls where certainty had perished long before the living arrived. Near evening, Borin called Gimli to the left side of the frame, where one of the recessed circles had begun to shift beneath gentle pressure. The movement was slight, barely enough to notice, yet it had not been there before. The accumulated dust was cleared away. Gimli placed both hands against the worn stone and pressed carefully. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a low grinding sound that seemed to awaken the mountain itself, the circle rotated no more than the width of a thumb before locking into a new position. Every dwarf in the chamber froze where he stood. The echo rolled away into darkness beyond the sealed doorway and continued long enough that none could guess how far it had traveled. No further movement followed. The great doors remained shut, silent and unmoving, yet the chamber no longer felt entirely still. Borin listened with his ear against the stone, while the others waited. "I hear nothing," he finally admitted, though uncertainty lingered in his voice. Gimli examined the turned circle without touching it again. "One lock among several," he said. "If one still answers after so many ages, the others may as well." Fra frowned deeply. Then perhaps they should remain untouched. Gimli did not answer immediately, because the same thought had already taken root in his own mind. Before leaving the chamber, Gimli stationed 4 experienced guards outside the unfinished gallery. They were instructed to admit no curious workers and to allow no one near the ancient doors without his express command. The guards accepted their duty without complaint, though each glanced toward the darkness beyond the excavation with growing unease. As the lanterns were lowered and footsteps faded into distant corridors, the hidden chamber settled once more into silence. Only the faint draft continued to move across the floor, whispering through cracks too narrow for any eye to follow. It carried with it a chill that belonged to places untouched by sunlight since the elder days. That evening, the great dining hall filled with the cheerful noise of the colony, yet Gimli found little pleasure in the feast before him. Musicians played old songs of Erebor, children raced between the stone tables, and mugs rose in laughter after another successful day's labor. Ordinarily, he welcomed such moments, for they reminded him why dwarves labored so tirelessly beneath the mountain. Tonight, his thoughts remained fixed upon the buried gate and the mechanism that had answered a single careful touch. Across the hall, Fra caught his eye, but wisely chose not to interrupt. Neither of them wished to burden the others with doubts that had not yet become danger. Long after the settlement had fallen asleep, Gimli walked alone through the quiet galleries, carrying a single lantern. The polished walls reflected its warm glow in countless fragments until the tunnels seemed filled with distant stars. He reached the guarded passage without speaking, nodded to the watchman, and stood for several moments before the sealed chamber beyond. No sound emerged from within. No movement disturbed the darkness, yet as he turned to leave, one of the guards quietly cleared his throat and said, "My lord, perhaps it was only settling stone, but an hour ago I thought I heard something beyond those doors." Gimli looked steadily at the weathered dwarf. "What kind of sound?" The guard hesitated before answering. It was almost like many small stones sliding together, though nothing here had fallen. Neither of them entered to investigate that night. Gimli simply ordered the watch doubled before returning to his chambers, though sleep refused to come easily. He had spent enough years beneath mountains to know that rock often shifted with changes in the earth, and reason urged him to dismiss the report. Still, another part of him, remembered different tunnels beneath another mountain, where innocent sounds had often been the first warning that something unseen had begun to stir. Outside, the stars wheeled peacefully above the white mountains, while far below them the ancient doors waited in perfect silence, as though listening for the next hand that dared to touch their forgotten locks. Morning brought no sign that anything had changed, yet the feeling of unease lingered beneath the mountain like a draught that refused to fade. Gimli rose before the first forge fires were lit and made his way once more to the western galleries, accompanied only by Frar and Borin. The guards reported that nothing had disturbed the chamber during the night, though each admitted that sleep had come poorly while standing watch beside the hidden doors. One of them pointed to the dusty floor near the threshold, where a scattering of fine grit had appeared beneath the seam, joining the two great slabs. It was not enough to suggest movement, but neither had it been there the previous evening. Gimli crouched to examine it, rubbing the powder between his fingers before letting it fall again. "Keep watching," he said, quietly. "If the mountain wishes to speak, we shall listen before we answer." The day's first task was to uncover the remainder of the gateway. Until now, much of its frame remained buried within untouched stone, concealing whatever mechanism its builders had devised. Under Gimli's careful direction, the miners worked with narrow chisels instead of heavy picks, removing the surrounding rock a hand's breadth at a time. Every strike was deliberate, and every fragment carried away before another blow was given. The labor tested the patience of younger dwarves accustomed to faster progress, but no one dared question the pace while their lord watched over the work himself. As the hours passed, more of the ancient craftsmanship emerged from the mountain, astonishing even the most experienced masons. By midday, the full outline of the gateway stood revealed. The doors were nearly twice the height of the tallest dwarf, and framed by broad pillars carved directly from a darker stone than any found elsewhere in the glittering caves. Their surface bore winding patterns that resembled roots descending into the earth, though every line had been shaped with geometric precision. Unlike dwarven ornament, which celebrated strength and symmetry, these carvings seemed intended to guide the eye downward toward the threshold itself. Fundin studied them in thoughtful silence before murmuring, "They wished every traveler to remember what lay beneath his feet." Gimli followed the old scholar's gaze, wondering whether the carvings honored the depths or warned against them. Borin soon called everyone's attention to another discovery. Hidden beneath centuries of mineral deposits, 6 circular recesses surrounded the doorway exactly as the first had suggested, 3 upon either side. Each possessed the same carefully fitted stone wheel capable of turning within its socket. The one Gimli had shifted the previous day remained in its new position, while the others stood untouched by time. Borin examined them closely with a small bronze mirror and a slender probe. "The workings are astonishing," he said, with genuine admiration. "There is scarcely room enough for dust between the moving parts. Whoever built this understood stone almost as if it were metal." Frar folded his arms and watched the ancient mechanisms without sharing Borin's excitement. "Fine craftsmanship alone is no reason to disturb an old door," he observed. "Many things have survived because wiser folk left them alone." Borin straightened and brushed the dust from his gloves. "And many wonders have remained hidden because fearful folk refused to look beyond them." The exchange might easily have grown sharper, but Gimli raised one broad hand before either dwarf could continue. "Both caution and courage have their place," he said. "We shall use each before this matter is finished." Neither argued further, though their expressions revealed that the debate had merely paused. That afternoon, Gimli summoned several of the oldest elders from among the colony. Few of them had ever ventured as widely as he had, yet each carried family histories stretching back through generations beyond counting. They gathered before the gateway with lanterns held high, studying every mark with quiet concentration. Some recognized similarities to forgotten decorative styles from distant mountain holds, while others insisted the stone belonged to no dwarven tradition whatsoever. One elder recalled a fragment of an ancient song mentioning hidden peoples beneath western mountains, but even he admitted the verses had been incomplete when his grandfather first taught them. Memory alone could not solve the mystery. The mountain guarded its past too well. Late in the day, a messenger arrived from the upper entrance, bearing letters from Gondor and Rohan. Trade agreements required Gimli's attention, and several wagons awaited inspection before continuing toward Minas Tirith. Ordinarily, he would have welcomed such business, for friendship between the kingdoms remained one of the great blessings won after the War of the Ring. Today, however, his thoughts remained divided. Even while speaking with merchants and reviewing inventories of worked stone and iron tools, part of his mind lingered beside the buried gateway. He answered every question correctly, yet afterward he realized he remembered almost none of the conversation. The mystery beneath the mountain had begun to occupy him completely. Before sunset, he returned once more to the western chamber. The workers had departed, leaving the unfinished gallery strangely quiet after a day filled with hammer blows and measured voices. Lantern light played across the newly uncovered pillars, revealing details invisible beneath brighter illumination. Gimli noticed tiny channels carved into the stone around the circular locks, so narrow that they could scarcely be seen except when light struck them at an angle. He traced one with his finger until it disappeared beneath the edge of the frame. Not decoration, he whispered to himself. Purpose. Borin knelt beside him and nodded slowly. The 6 wheels are linked. Together they experimented without haste. One by one, Borin applied gentle pressure to the remaining circles, while Gimli watched for movement elsewhere upon the gateway. Most refused to turn at first, held fast by age and mineral deposits. Warm water loosened some of the hardened stone, while careful scraping freed others enough to move a fraction of an inch. By nightfall, only 2 additional wheels had rotated into new positions, each accompanied by the same deep grinding sound that echoed away into unseen darkness. Nothing else happened. The great doors neither opened nor shifted, yet everyone present felt the mechanism settling somewhere within the mountain, as though ancient parts had awakened after centuries of perfect stillness. They had just begun preparing to leave when an unexpected sound reached them. It came not from the doorway itself, but from somewhere far beyond it, so faint that at first Gimli wondered whether memory had deceived his hearing. A dull knock echoed once. Several heartbeats later, it came again, distant and irregular, followed by silence. Every dwarf in the chamber looked toward the sealed doors. No one spoke until Freyr quietly asked, "Did all of us hear that?" Borin swallowed before answering, unless the mountain has begun placing the same dream into every ear. The silence that followed seemed heavier than stone. Gimli stepped close to the seam and rested one hand against its cold surface. He closed his eyes, listening with every ounce of the sharpened awareness earned through long years beneath mountains. At first, there was nothing except the faint whisper of moving air. Then, somewhere beyond the sealed passage, came another hollow sound. It was softer now, almost uncertain, like a pebble striking distant rock. He could not judge its direction or its source. It might have been the settling of forgotten caverns. It might have been something else entirely. "We stop here," Gimli said at last, his voice calm though his thoughts were anything but. "No more locks are to be turned until we understand what answers them." Borin opened his mouth as if to protest, then saw the resolve in Gimli's expression and nodded without another word. Fra looked quietly relieved, while the others hurried to gather their tools. Before the last lantern was extinguished, Gimli cast one final glance toward the immense stone doors. They remained motionless, unchanged to every eye. Yet deep within the mountain, beyond the reach of light and memory, something had heard the ancient mechanism awaken, and for the first time in countless ages, something had answered. The next 3 days passed without further work upon the hidden gateway. Gimli gave the order himself, though many among the miners struggled to understand his restraint. The western galleries remained under guard, while ordinary excavation continued elsewhere in the glittering caves, and life within the colony gradually settled back into its familiar rhythm. Hammers rang through new chambers, wagons carried dressed stone toward the upper halls, and merchants from Rohan departed, with carts laden with carved pillars and polished crystal. Yet beneath the appearance of calm, curiosity spread more quickly than any official command could contain it. Every meal ended with whispered questions, and every gathering of craftsmen returned sooner or later to the ancient doors buried beneath the mountain. Gimli welcomed neither rumor nor needless fear, and so he chose to confront both with honesty. One evening he assembled the senior foremen in the Hall of Pillars, where broad columns of white stone rose like frozen waterfalls beneath glittering ceilings. He spoke plainly, withholding neither the discovery nor the strange sounds that had followed the turning of the ancient locks. "No danger has entered these halls," he said, his deep voice carrying easily through the chamber. "But neither shall we pretend that we understand what lies beyond those doors. Until we do, every man and woman beneath this mountain will continue their work with care rather than haste." The foreman accepted his judgment without argument, for most had known him since the colony's earliest days and trusted experience more readily than excitement. That same night, Gimli summoned Fundin to his private chambers, where shelves of old maps and weathered records filled niches carved into the walls. The elderly runekeeper carried with him several heavy volumes copied from libraries in Erebor before the dragon's coming, along with loose scrolls preserved through generations of careful hands. Together they worked long after midnight, comparing forgotten histories with travelers' accounts from the White Mountains. They found references to abandoned fortresses of men, scattered tales of vanished shepherd tribes, and fragmentary notes concerning ancient caves known only to hunters. None mentioned doors of unmatched stone hidden beneath the glittering caves. At length, Fundin leaned back with weary eyes and sighed. Either history has forgotten this place, or those who knew it wished the memory buried. Gimli closed one of the great books with deliberate care. "Secrets rarely remain hidden without effort," he replied. "Someone built that gateway to endure longer than kingdoms. I cannot believe they expected chance alone to protect it." His thoughts drifted toward Khazad-dûm, despite himself. Once, that greatest of dwarven realms had believed stone alone sufficient to guard its deepest halls. Pride had taught a cruel lesson beneath the misty mountains, one paid for in blood and exile. He had no desire to repeat such mistakes beneath the White Mountains, however different this mystery might prove to be. On the fourth morning, an unexpected report reached him before breakfast had ended. 2 hunters returning from the upper slopes claimed they had found the remains of several mountain goats near a narrow ravine west of the Hornburg. Wolves were not uncommon in the hills, yet these carcasses bore no marks of teeth upon the flesh. Instead, their bones appeared strangely broken, as though the animals had fled through jagged stone and fallen to their deaths in blind panic. The hunters admitted they had seen no predators nearby, only scattered rocks freshly disturbed along the edge of the ravine. Gimli listened carefully without drawing conclusions. The mountains held dangers enough without inventing new ones. Later that day, he climbed to the surface himself, accompanied by Frar and 4 experienced guards. Bright summer sunlight greeted them after the warm glow of the caverns, and the clean wind sweeping down from the white mountains carried scents of pine and wild grass instead of coal smoke and stone dust. From the heights above the glittering caves, the green fields of Rohan stretched far into the distance, beneath a cloudless sky. Peace lay upon the land with such completeness that the strange discoveries below seemed almost impossible to believe. Gimli paused beside the walls of the Hornburg and rested his hands upon ancient stone that had witnessed both despair and triumph. It reminded him that appearances often concealed greater truths. The hunters led them westward, along narrow paths, winding between weathered cliffs. Before long, they reached the ravine they had described, where broken stones littered the ground beneath steep walls of grey limestone. The dead goats still lay where they had fallen, untouched by scavengers despite the passing days. Gimli knelt beside one and examined the injuries with practiced eyes. Several bones had indeed shattered from the fall, but the animal's hooves bore fresh chips and deep scratches, unlike those caused by ordinary flight across rough ground. It looked as though the creature had scrambled desperately over stone harder than these hills normally offered. Frar crouched nearby, studying the disturbed earth. "Something frightened them," he murmured. "The question is what?" Their search continued through the afternoon without uncovering an answer. They found no wolf tracks, no bear prints, and no sign of orcs or other enemies that might have survived the passing of Sauron's shadow. Only once did one of the guards halt, suddenly beside a shelf of exposed rock. A narrow crack descended into darkness between 2 boulders, scarcely wide enough for a fox to enter, yet a steady current of cool air flowed upward from its depths. Gimli lowered a lantern as far as the rope allowed, but its light vanished long before reaching the bottom. He frowned thoughtfully. The White Mountains were riddled with hidden fissures, yet this draught felt stronger than such a narrow opening should have allowed. Frar tested the edges of the crack with his hammer. "Old stone," he observed. "Very old. No fresh collapse here." Gimli nodded, but remained troubled. The air rising from below carried a faint mineral scent, unlike anything familiar within the glittering caves. It reminded him vaguely of damp caverns left untouched for centuries, where water had carved silent passages beyond the reach of any map. He looked toward the towering peaks disappearing into the western horizon. If unseen tunnels threaded these mountains more deeply than anyone realized, the hidden gateway beneath the colony might not stand alone. As evening approached, they returned to the settlement without speaking much along the road. Each man seemed occupied by his own thoughts, measuring scattered clues that refused to form a clear picture. When they descended once more into the warm light of the glittering caves, the familiar sounds of home brought a measure of comfort. Children still laughed in the galleries. Forges still glowed with cheerful fire. Every ordinary noise seemed precious against the silence waiting beyond the ancient doors. That comfort did not last until nightfall. Barely an hour after darkness settled outside the mountain, one of the western guards came running through the lower halls with dust upon his boots and alarm plain upon his face. He found Gimli in the great workshop, inspecting newly finished stonework, and stopped only long enough to catch his breath. "My lord," he said, struggling to steady his voice. We heard it again. The busy hall fell silent around him. Even the ringing of hammers ceased as nearby craftsmen turned to listen. "What did you hear?" Gimli asked, already reaching for the axe resting against the workshop wall. The guard swallowed before answering. Not a knocking this time. Footsteps. No one spoke for several heartbeats. Slow, the guard continued, heavy enough that the stone carried the sound. They came from beyond the doors, stopped for a while, and then faded away. Frar's face hardened at once, while Borin, who had been working nearby, looked toward Gimli with equal parts excitement and concern. "Did anyone open the chamber?" Gimli asked. "No, my lord. We never crossed the threshold." Within moments, a dozen armed dwarves hurried through the western galleries, their lanterns casting long golden shadows across unfinished walls. The chamber lay exactly as they had left it. The ancient gateway stood sealed. The 6 great locks remained untouched since the last examination. Gimli dismissed everyone except Frar, Borin, and the 2 guards who had reported the sound. Together they stood before the silent doors, listening. For a long while, nothing disturbed the stillness except the quiet hiss of lantern flames. Then, so faintly that Gimli wondered whether memory itself had taken shape, a single measured footstep echoed from somewhere beyond the ancient stone, followed by another, each separated by long moments of absolute silence, before both vanished once more into the immeasurable darkness below. No one moved after the sound faded. The lantern flames remained steady, untouched by any wind, and the immense stone doors stood as silent as they had on the day they were uncovered. Gimli listened until his ears began to ache from the effort, hoping for another echo that might reveal direction or distance. None came. The mountain seemed to hold its breath, as though unwilling to betray whatever secret rested beyond the ancient barrier. At last, Gimli lowered his hand from the haft of his axe. "We leave nothing to chance," he said quietly. "From this hour, the western galleries remain under constant watch, day and night." The guards accepted the order without complaint, though unease was plain upon every face. Fresh watch rotations were assigned before dawn, and no guard would stand alone. Gimli also ordered that signal horns be placed at 3 points between the hidden chamber and the main settlement. Should anything emerge unexpectedly, the colony would have warning before danger reached the inhabited halls. Some of the younger dwarves protested that such measures were excessive for a mystery that had produced nothing more than distant sounds. Gimli answered them with patient firmness. A careful miner grows old. A careless one becomes a lesson told beside the fire. No one argued after that. For the next 2 days, nothing happened. The guards reported silence. The mysterious doors remained unmoving, and ordinary work resumed throughout the colony. Even Borin began to wonder whether the strange echoes had been no more than shifting stone awakened by the ancient mechanism. Frar did not share that optimism, though he kept his thoughts mostly to himself. Gimli noticed that several of the older miners had quietly begun wearing their axes, even while performing routine labor, a habit left over from darker years in the lonely mountain after Smaug's fall. It was not panic. It was memory expressing itself through caution. On the evening of the 3rd day, a different kind of report reached Gimli. One of the food keepers requested an audience, carrying a ledger tucked beneath his arm. At first, the matter seemed trivial. Several sacks of dried mushrooms stored in the western granaries had disappeared during the previous night. Missing provisions occasionally occurred through simple error, especially in a growing settlement. Yet the keeper insisted he had counted the inventory twice before sealing the storeroom. No lock was broken, he explained. No door forced. The sacks were simply gone. Gimli frowned. The loss itself mattered little. The manner of it did. The storeroom stood only a short distance from the western excavation, though several finished galleries separated the two. Gimli inspected it personally before sunrise. The heavy oak door showed no damage, and the iron lock functioned perfectly. Shelves lined the walls in orderly rows, filled with preserved meats, grain, dried herbs, and barrels of clean spring water. Nothing appeared disturbed except for an empty section where 5 heavy sacks should have rested. Borin examined the hinges, while Fra searched the floor for signs of dragging or footprints. Neither found anything unusual until Gimli knelt beside the rear wall. Near the base of the stone, almost hidden behind stacked barrels, lay several tiny fragments of pale grit, unlike the surrounding floor. Gimli picked one up between thick fingers. It was harder than ordinary limestone and glittered faintly in the lantern light. Fra joined him, studying the particles with narrowed eyes. "Not from this chamber," he said after a moment. "I've never cut stone like this in these caves." Borin looked toward the solid rear wall. If no one entered through the door. He left the sentence unfinished, unwilling to give voice to the thought forming in every mind. Gimli ordered the entire western quarter searched without delay. Small parties spread through workshops, unfinished tunnels, storage chambers, and water passages, examining every corner with practiced care. They found no intruders, no hidden openings, and no evidence that anyone had crossed the settlement unnoticed. By midday, the search ended with more questions than answers. The missing food remained missing. The strange mineral fragments matched nothing else within the glittering caves. Even the air carried no unfamiliar scent. Whatever had happened had left almost no trace behind. That evening, Gimli chose to visit the hidden gateway alone. He carried only his axe, a lantern, and a coil of climbing rope slung across one shoulder. The guard stepped aside as he entered the chamber without speaking. Once inside, he extinguished every lantern except his own. The reduced light sharpened the silence until even the faint crackle of the flame seemed loud against the ancient stone. He approached the sealed doors slowly, studying every inch of their surface. Nothing had changed, yet something about the chamber felt subtly different, though he could not immediately name it. He finally discovered the difference near the threshold. A thin line of fine dust stretched across the floor, exactly where he remembered sweeping it clean the previous evening. The dust itself was ordinary enough, but several tiny interruptions crossed it from one side to the other. They were so faint that another eye might have missed them entirely. Gimli knelt until his beard brushed the stone and examined the marks closely. They were not boot prints, nor were they scratches left by dragging tools. They resembled the impressions of many narrow, pointed feet, no longer than a man's thumb, arranged in uneven clusters before disappearing against the ancient doors. His hand drifted instinctively toward the handle of his axe. He counted the impressions carefully. They came from no creature known to him. Rats left smoother tracks. Lizards did not dwell in such cold depths. Even the smallest goblins possessed broader feet than these delicate marks. Gimli followed them as far as they remained visible. Every trail ended at the seam between the great stone doors. None led away from it. For a long moment, he simply stared at the impossible evidence before him. He called quietly for the nearest guard. Together they examined the floor without disturbing it. The guard's weathered face lost its color beneath his beard. "Those were not here yesterday," he whispered. Gimli nodded. No. They searched the rest of the chamber and discovered several more sets of the same tiny impressions near the walls, each leading toward the threshold before vanishing. None pointed in the opposite direction. It looked as though a number of small creatures had approached the sealed gateway from inside the chamber itself, only to disappear into solid stone. Word spread no farther than Gimli allowed. He ordered the floor covered with fine sand before dawn, instructing the guards to touch nothing they might find upon it. If fresh tracks appeared, they would reveal more than guesses ever could. The men obeyed without question, carefully smoothing the pale surface until every previous mark vanished beneath it. Gimli remained watching until the task was complete. Then he rested one broad palm against the ancient stone once more. The doors felt as cold as winter. Behind them lay only silence. Yet the silence had changed. It no longer seemed empty. Somewhere beyond the barrier, beyond the 6 ancient locks and the forgotten halls hidden beneath the white mountains, something was moving with quiet purpose. Whether it watched the dwarves with fear, curiosity, or darker intent, Gimli could not yet tell. But for the first time since the gateway had been uncovered, he no longer believed they were studying a forgotten relic. He believed that whatever had built it, or whatever now lived beyond it, had begun to notice them in return. The layer of fine sand remained untouched through the first watch of the night. 2 experienced guards stood outside the chamber, while a third remained within, seated upon a low stone block with a lantern resting beside him. The hours passed slowly, measured only by the soft drip of distant water and the occasional creak of timber supports settling elsewhere in the galleries. Nothing stirred near the ancient gateway. More than once the guard found himself staring at the seam between the great doors, wondering whether his eyes had begun to invent movement where none existed. By dawn, he welcomed the sound of approaching footsteps more eagerly than he would ever admit. Gimli arrived with Frar and Borin before the morning meal. Without speaking, the 3 crossed the chamber toward the prepared floor. The sand appeared undisturbed until the lantern light reached its center. Then Borin suddenly stopped. "There," he whispered. A trail of tiny impressions wound across the pale surface in a crooked line. They had not emerged from the inhabited galleries. They began precisely at the threshold beneath the sealed doors and wandered several yards into the chamber before circling aimlessly and returning once more to the ancient seam. The guard who had stood watch looked genuinely shaken. "No one entered," he said immediately, seeing the question forming in Gimli's eyes. "I never looked away from the doors for more than a heartbeat. Nothing crossed the chamber." Gimli crouched beside the tracks, studying every detail before anyone else approached. The impressions were clearer than those discovered the previous evening. Each consisted of 3 slender toes ending in sharp points, too narrow for any boot and too delicate for the feet of orcs or goblins. Whatever had made them possessed surprising balance, for the stride remained steady even where loose sand should have shifted beneath its weight. Frar slowly circled the chamber, while Borin examined the doorway itself. Neither found hidden cracks large enough to admit even the smallest creature. The great stone slabs remained tightly joined from top to bottom. Borin pressed his ear against the cold surface and listened for several long moments before stepping back. "Nothing," he said quietly. "No breathing, no movement." Gimli remained kneeling beside the strange tracks. He reached toward one impression, then stopped just short of touching it. Experience urged him to preserve every clue exactly as it lay. By midday, the news could no longer be hidden from the colony's senior craftsman. Gimli gathered them in the Hall of Maps, rather than allowing rumors to spread unchecked through the settlement. Several reacted with disbelief when they heard of the mysterious tracks. Others exchanged uneasy glances, but remained silent. Fundin listened carefully until every detail had been described, then rested both hands upon his staff. If these marks truly begin and end at the sealed doors, he said, we face either a puzzle beyond reason or a craft beyond our understanding. Gimli answered with a grim nod. I would rather assume the second than trust the first. The discussion ended with a difficult decision. The gateway could remain sealed forever, leaving the mystery unresolved, or the remaining locks could be turned to discover what lay beyond before unseen visitors grew bolder. Neither choice pleased Gimli. If something already passed through the barrier despite its closure, perhaps the doors no longer served their original purpose. Yet opening them without preparation invited dangers impossible to measure. Fra spoke first. A locked gate may protect both sides, Borin answered before anyone else could. And if one side has already found another path? The room fell silent once again. That evening, Gimli sought solitude in one of the oldest crystal chambers of the glittering caves. Water dripped gently into a still pool whose surface reflected countless glittering lights from the walls above. He had often come there during difficult years to weigh decisions without interruption. His thoughts wandered to the Fellowship, to Aragorn's calm judgment, to Legolas's patience, and even to Gandalf, whose wisdom had often seen farther than others guessed. None stood beside him now. The burden belonged to him alone, for these caves were his responsibility, and every life beneath the mountain rested upon his choice. As he sat beside the quiet water, another memory returned unbidden. Long ago, before entering Moria, Gandalf had hesitated before the Western Gate, sensing dangers hidden beyond stone that no eye could perceive. The wizard had not feared darkness itself. He had feared ignorance. Gimli understood that lesson more clearly now than he had then. A threat left unexplored seldom became less dangerous simply because one refused to look at it. He rose from the pool with his decision finally settled. The following morning, every available guard assembled before the western excavation. Word had spread that something important was about to occur, though only a handful knew the full truth. Gimli addressed them plainly. Today we finish what chance began. We open these doors, but we do so as dwarves, not with reckless hands, but with disciplined ones. Behind him, Borin supervised the placement of ropes, lanterns, spare oil, and supplies, enough for several days should exploration become necessary. Fra organized a reserve force farther back in the galleries, ready to seal the passage if events turned against them. The chamber grew utterly silent as Gimli approached the ancient gateway. 5 stone wheels remained untouched. One by one, under Borin's careful guidance, they were cleaned, examined, and gently turned into alignment with the first. Each movement awakened the same deep, grinding sound within the mountain. The echoes overlapped until they blended into a single low rumble that seemed to travel endlessly through hidden passages beneath the white mountains. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Loose pebbles trembled across the floor. Somewhere deep below, ancient mechanisms answered one another after ages of silence. When the 6th and final wheel locked into place, nothing happened for several heartbeats. Borin looked toward Gimli with uncertain eyes. "Perhaps that is all," he began. Before the sentence ended, a heavy thud echoed from within the gateway. Another followed, louder than before. The immense stone slabs shuddered almost imperceptibly. A sharp hiss escaped from the narrow seam as trapped air burst outward, carrying the cold scent of ancient earth. The guards instinctively tightened their grips upon shields and axes. No one spoke. Then, the mountain groaned. It was not the sound of collapsing rock. It was deeper, slower, as though enormous weights hidden beyond the walls had begun to move for the first time since forgotten ages. Dust poured from the carved frame, while unseen counterweights rumbled somewhere beneath the floor. The seam widened by the width of a finger. Cold blackness appeared between the doors, absolute and lightless. The opening grew another inch, then another, until the two colossal slabs began inching inward with terrible slowness, each movement accompanied by echoes that rolled away into unfathomable depths. No creature emerged to greet them. No voice welcomed or warned them. Only a breath of icy air flowed steadily from the widening passage, carrying a smell unlike anything found in the glittering caves. It was dry, ancient, and tinged with the faint odor of minerals left untouched by living hands for thousands of years. Gimli lifted his lantern toward the opening, but its warm light vanished into the darkness after only a few yards, swallowed as though the mountain itself had chosen to keep its secrets hidden a little longer. Behind him, the assembled dwarves waited in absolute silence, staring into the black passage that no eye had seen since the forgotten builders had closed those mighty gates in an age beyond memory. For a long moment, no one crossed the threshold. The open gateway seemed less like an invitation than a warning preserved in stone through forgotten ages. Cold air continued to drift steadily from the darkness beyond, carrying with it the dry scent of ancient caverns untouched by forge smoke or living breath. Gimli raised his lantern higher, but the light reached only the first stretch of smooth floor before dissolving into perfect blackness. The passage beyond was remarkably broad, far wider than any natural tunnel, and its ceiling disappeared beyond the reach of the flame. "No one enters carelessly," Gimli said at last. "We go only with those prepared to return." He selected 8 companions from among the colony's most experienced dwarves. Fra stood at his right hand without waiting to be asked, while Borin quietly gathered measuring cords, chalk and spare lanterns instead of heavier tools. Fundin insisted upon joining them despite his years, arguing that forgotten places deserved someone capable of recognizing what younger eyes might overlook. Gimli refused him with genuine regret. "Your wisdom is worth more to us alive than brave beneath unknown stone," he said gently. The old runekeeper accepted the decision after a long silence, though disappointment lingered plainly upon his face. Before the company departed, he pressed an old parchment map into Gimli's hands. "You will not find this place upon it," Fundin admitted. "But perhaps one forgotten road will lead your thoughts toward another." The remaining guards took their positions beside the gateway. Thick ropes were secured to iron rings driven into the floor, stretching into the darkness so that the explorers could find their way back, should smoke, dust, or sudden darkness rob them of sight. Fra inspected every knot personally before giving a satisfied nod. Borin checked each lantern twice, ensuring fresh oil filled every reservoir. Gimli fastened his axe across his back until needed, preferring to keep one hand free while examining unfamiliar stone. The preparations took nearly an hour, and no one complained of the delay. Beneath a mountain, haste had buried more dwarves than any enemy. At Gimli's signal, the company crossed the threshold. Their boots echoed sharply against smooth stone, unlike any floor within the glittering caves. The passage sloped gently downward, straight as an arrow for nearly 100 paces, before vanishing into shadow. Every surface had been shaped with extraordinary care. Walls rose on either side without visible tool marks, polished until they reflected the lantern light in faint golden ribbons. The ceiling remained hidden high above, yet occasional droplets of water fell from unseen heights, striking the floor with hollow notes that traveled astonishing distances. Gimli paused after the first 50 paces and looked back. The open gateway already seemed impossibly far away, its warm light reduced to a narrow rectangle glowing faintly behind them. The silence possessed a peculiar quality. It was not empty, as abandoned halls often were. Instead, it seemed full of restrained echoes, waiting to awaken at the slightest sound. Every footstep lingered longer than expected, before fading into the depths ahead. When Borin accidentally brushed his shoulder against the wall, the scrape repeated itself again and again, until no one could tell whether the final whisper had come from nearby or from some distant chamber beyond their hearing. Fra glanced upward uneasily. "These halls carry sound too well," he murmured. Gimli answered without turning. "Then we shall give them little to carry." After nearly half an hour, the great passage opened into an immense chamber. The company halted almost instinctively, as their lanterns revealed only fragments of its vastness. Massive pillars rose from the floor in orderly rows, each thicker than the oldest trees of Fangorn, and disappearing into darkness overhead. Between them stretched broad avenues paved with enormous stone slabs, fitted so precisely that centuries had failed to widen their seams. Dust lay everywhere, untouched by recent footsteps, except for one winding trail of tiny three-toed impressions leading deeper into the chamber. Borin knelt beside them. "The same tracks," he whispered. "Only clearer." They followed the trail cautiously. As more lanterns spread their light across the floor, details slowly emerged from the darkness. Here stood the remains of broad stairways descending toward lower galleries. There rested enormous stone benches carved directly into the walls. Farther on lay broken fragments of statues, so weathered that no face remained recognizable. Whatever people had once inhabited this place had built on a scale unlike either dwarves or men. Even Gimli, who had seen the grandeur of Khazad-dûm before its deepest horrors claimed it, found himself struggling to imagine the labor required to shape such a city beneath the mountain. Yet for all its magnificence, there was no sign of life. Fra stooped beside one shattered statue and brushed away the dust with careful hands. Only the lower half remained intact, revealing heavy robes carved with patterns unlike those surrounding the gateway. "Not warriors," he observed quietly. Whoever these were, they wished to be remembered for something other than battle. Gimli examined the broken stone thoughtfully. No weapons adorned the figure. No crown or scepter survived. The craftsmanship celebrated builders rather than conquerors, hands rather than swords. That struck him as strangely familiar despite every visible difference between these forgotten people and his own. As the company advanced farther into the chamber, Borin suddenly raised one hand. Every lantern halted. Ahead, beyond the nearest line of pillars, something had moved. It lasted only an instant, little more than a pale shape slipping silently behind stone before vanishing once again. No footsteps followed. No voice echoed through the hall. Gimli stared steadily into the darkness, while every dwarf instinctively reached for his weapon. After several long moments, he spoke in a calm voice. "Show yourself. We haven't come seeking needless quarrel." Only silence answered him. Then, from somewhere among the distant pillars, came a faint clicking sound unlike anything they had yet heard. Another answered farther away. Then another still farther, each separated by long stretches of quiet until the echoes seemed to circle the enormous chamber itself. Fra frowned. "Signals?" he asked softly. Gimli listened carefully before replying. "Perhaps. Or perhaps only creatures speaking in a tongue we do not know." Either possibility demanded caution. They resumed their march more slowly than before. The strange clicking did not return, yet the sense of unseen company never quite faded. More than once, Gimli caught the fleeting impression of movement at the edge of the lantern light, only to find empty stone when he turned his head. The tiny tracks continued faithfully ahead of them, weaving between the pillars before descending a broad staircase whose lower steps disappeared into darkness. There, upon the first landing, Borin discovered something lying half-buried beneath centuries of dust. It was a leather pouch, no larger than a closed fist. The leather had dried and darkened with unimaginable age, yet careful stitching still held its shape. Gimli opened it slowly while the others watched. Inside rested several smooth white stones, carved into small discs, each marked with the same flowing symbols seen upon the ancient gateway. None resembled coins, none appeared decorative. They had been handled often before being lost, their edges worn smooth by countless fingers. Fundin would have recognized the markings instantly if he had been present, but here beneath the mountain, no one could guess their purpose. Gimli returned the pouch to his belt. "We take nothing else," he said. "Not until we understand whose halls these were." His companions nodded in agreement, relieved that curiosity had not overcome wisdom. Together they descended the broad staircase into the deeper levels of the forgotten city. Above them, the open gateway lay far behind, hidden now by endless corridors and forests of stone pillars. Before them stretched only darkness, silent and immeasurable, while somewhere beyond the reach of every lantern, unseen eyes quietly watched the strangers who had crossed the ancient gates at last. The staircase descended for what felt like the better part of an hour, winding gently through the heart of the mountain. Unlike the rough stairs carved by dwarven hands, these broad steps showed almost no sign of wear, despite the passing of countless centuries. Their edges remained sharp, and the smooth stone reflected the lantern light with a dull silver sheen. The silence deepened as the company descended, until even breathing seemed loud enough to disturb whatever slumbered in the forgotten halls. Gimli counted the landings without speaking. By the 20th he stopped counting altogether, for the mountain had become too vast to measure by ordinary means. At last the stair opened into another great chamber, smaller than the one above, but no less remarkable. Here the walls were covered with relief carvings, preserved almost perfectly by the dry air. They did not depict battles or kings upon thrones. Instead, they showed long processions of robed figures carrying tools, shaping stone, guiding streams through carved channels, and raising immense arches beneath towering ceilings. The same flowing symbols appeared beside many of the scenes, though none among the company could read them. Fra studied one carving with narrowed eyes. "They honored builders," he murmured. "Perhaps even more than we do." Borin moved from panel to panel, his curiosity overcoming every trace of fear. "Look here," he called softly, raising his lantern toward one section where dozens of figures worked together around an enormous circular doorway. Unlike the gateway through which the dwarves had entered, this one stood open, revealing lines descending into darkness beneath the city. Above it, several robed craftsmen were shown placing great stone slabs into position, while others watched from behind them. Gimli examined the carving in thoughtful silence. "They were sealing something," he said at length. "Not building a road, but closing one." Fra's expression hardened. "Then perhaps we should have left their work untouched." No one answered him. The image itself spoke loudly enough. They continued onward through a broad avenue whose ceiling was supported by graceful arches unlike anything found in dwarven halls. Here and there lay the remains of abandoned furnishings carved from solid stone. Long tables stood where they had been left. Benches remained upright despite their great age. A row of tall pillars flanked what had once been a wide entrance into another chamber, but the roof beyond had collapsed long ago, filling the passage with jagged rock. Dust covered everything in an undisturbed blanket. Not even the tiny three-toed tracks appeared here. The company paused beside what seemed to have been a gathering hall. Borin knelt to examine the floor, where faint circular marks suggested that large objects had once rested there before being removed. Nothing was abandoned in haste, he observed. Whoever left this city carried away what mattered most. Gimli slowly turned, studying the empty chamber. He noticed no scattered tools, no broken wagons, no signs of panic or violence. Even the fallen roof appeared to have collapsed centuries after the place had been deserted. It was as though an entire people had quietly departed, leaving only stone behind. A sudden sound interrupted his thoughts. Click. It came from somewhere ahead. Another answered from farther away. Click. Then silence returned. Every dwarf froze. The sounds were clearer now than before. No longer distant echoes, but deliberate signals passing through unseen passages beyond the lantern light. Gimli lifted one hand, and the company extinguished all but 2 lanterns. Darkness flowed around them at once, leaving only small pools of warm light amid the endless black. They waited without speaking. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. Then Borin quietly pointed toward the far end of the avenue. Several pale shapes stood between the distant pillars. They were scarcely taller than a dwarf's waist, thin as reeds, and almost colorless against the stone behind them. Their long limbs remained perfectly still, while oversized black eyes reflected the lantern glow like polished obsidian. No armor covered them. No weapons could be seen. Their narrow heads tilted slightly as they watched the strangers in complete silence. Frar's hand tightened upon his axe. "They're there," he whispered. "I see them," Gimli replied. The creatures neither advanced nor fled. They simply observed. One slowly raised an impossibly slender hand. Another answered with 2 quick clicks made somewhere inside its throat. The others turned at once and slipped behind the pillars with astonishing speed. Not one footstep reached the dwarves. Within moments, the avenue stood empty once more. Borin hurried forward before Gimli could stop him, reaching the place where the creatures had stood. His lantern swept across the floor, revealing fresh tracks impressed into the dust. They matched those found beyond the ancient gateway exactly. 3 narrow toes, light steps, remarkably even spacing despite their sudden retreat. "They're real," Borin breathed. Gimli joined him and knelt beside the prince. "They were never trying to hide their passing," he said quietly. "Only themselves." Frar scanned the surrounding darkness. If they wished us harm, they had every chance. "Perhaps," Gimli answered. "Or perhaps they wished to know whether we deserved it." The company pressed onward with greater caution than before. The broad avenue gradually narrowed until it entered a series of natural caverns where the worked stone gave way to untouched rock. Here streams flowed through winding channels beneath crystal formations that glittered faintly in the lantern light. The ancient builders had carved narrow walkways beside the water, following the shape of the caves instead of forcing them into straight lines. The craftsmanship suggested respect rather than conquest. Whoever these people had been, they had learned to live with the mountain instead of mastering it. Hours later, they reached a narrow bridge spanning a deep chasm. The opposite side vanished into darkness beyond the lanterns. Cold air rose steadily from below, When Borin dropped a pebble over the edge, they listened. 1 heartbeat. 5. 10. 20. No sound returned. Even Borin's confident expression faded. "This gulf reaches farther than any mine I've known," he admitted quietly. Gimli stepped carefully onto the bridge. It was carved from a single arch of dark stone, scarcely wide enough for 3 dwarves to walk abreast. No railing guarded its sides. Age had not weakened it in the slightest. Halfway across, he paused and raised his lantern toward the darkness below. Far beneath the bridge, for the briefest instant, dozens of tiny pale lights appeared. They moved together, then disappeared. Not reflections. Not crystals. Eyes. Before Gimli could speak, the clicking began again. This time it rose not from ahead, but from every side of the chasm, echoing softly through unseen caverns until the mountain itself seemed alive with hidden voices. None sounded angry. None sounded fearful. They called to one another with measured rhythm, passing messages deeper into the darkness beyond the bridge. Gimli slowly lowered his lantern. "They know exactly where we are," he said. No one answered. Across the gulf, somewhere beyond the reach of every light, another sound drifted upward through the endless black. It was not the delicate clicking of the pale creatures. It was a deep, distant roar. The sound rolled through the mountain like thunder trapped beneath stone, lingering long after it faded, and every pale, clicking voice stopped at once. No one spoke after the roar faded into the depths. The silence that followed felt altogether different from the quiet they had known before. Until that moment, the hidden city had seemed abandoned, except for the pale watchers who slipped between the pillars. Now the mountain itself appeared to be listening. Gimli remained motionless upon the bridge, his lantern held high, waiting to hear whether the sound would return. It did not. Yet the absence of the clicking voices troubled him even more than the roar. Whatever creatures had watched the company so carefully were now afraid enough to fall completely silent. Fra stepped beside him with measured care, testing each pace upon the narrow bridge before trusting his weight to it. "That was no shifting stone," he said under his breath. Gimli nodded without taking his eyes from the darkness below. "No, and it came from farther beneath us than I believed these halls could reach." Borin glanced uneasily over the edge into the abyss where the tiny lights had vanished. The pale folk heard it before we did. They knew what it meant. None of them wished to finish the thought aloud. Fear recognized fear more quickly than words ever could. The company crossed the bridge without delay. Every dwarf instinctively tightened his grip upon shield or axe, and every lantern flame seemed smaller than before against the vast darkness surrounding them. The passage beyond climbed gently through natural caverns where the ancient builders had laid broad stone paths across uneven ground. Strange crystal veins glimmered faintly within the walls, giving the rock a pale blue sheen even beyond the reach of the lanterns. Small streams trickled through carefully carved channels before disappearing into unseen cracks below. Despite the beauty of the place, no bird, insect, or familiar cave creature stirred anywhere along the path. Life had retreated from these depths long ago. After nearly an hour, they discovered signs that the forgotten city had not been entirely abandoned in peace. Several great pillars lay broken across a wide corridor, not from age but from tremendous force. Stone blocks weighing many tons had been hurled aside, as though they were little more than loose gravel. One section of the polished floor bore long gouges that ran straight across its surface before vanishing beneath fallen rubble. Borin knelt beside them, laying his hand within one of the deep scars. "No tool made these," he said quietly, "nor any ordinary beast." Fra studied the shattered pillars with growing concern. Whatever did this possessed strength enough to break a hall built to endure for ages? Gimli slowly examined the ruined passage. Unlike the abandoned chambers above, this place carried unmistakable signs of violence. The broken stone had not weathered naturally. Great cracks radiated outward from impacts that must have shaken the mountain when they were first struck. Yet there were still no bones, no scattered weapons, no remains of desperate defenders. The forgotten people had either escaped before the destruction reached them, or carried away their dead with extraordinary care. He found that thought strangely comforting. It suggested discipline rather than panic, even in the face of overwhelming danger. Beyond the collapsed corridor, the company entered a vast circular chamber, unlike any they had yet seen. Tier upon tier of broad stone seats rose around its outer walls, descending toward a great open space at the center. There stood a single pillar carved from flawless black stone that reached upward until its top vanished into darkness. Flowing symbols covered every side of the pillar from floor to ceiling, untouched by time. Around its base rested dozens of smooth stone pedestals arranged in careful circles. Most stood empty, though a few still held small crystal spheres clouded by age. Gimli approached one cautiously. The crystal was dull now, yet faint traces of pale light still stirred somewhere deep inside it. Fundin would have marveled at the chamber. Gimli regretted more keenly than ever that the old runekeeper had remained behind. Here lay a place that had clearly held great importance to the forgotten builders. It might have been a council hall, a place of learning, or something altogether different. The carvings offered no obvious answers. One panel depicted robed figures gathered around the central pillar with their hands raised toward it, while another showed long lines of travelers descending into the depths, carrying bundles upon their backs. The final carving visible near the entrance portrayed the same people sealing an enormous gate, while others looked back over their shoulders toward a darkness represented by rough, jagged lines, unlike the graceful workmanship surrounding them. "They were leaving," Fra said softly. "They were fleeing," Borin answered. Gimli remained silent. The difference between those two words might determine everything. A faint clicking echoed from somewhere behind the outer seats. Every head turned at once. This time, the pale creatures did not flee. 5 of them stepped cautiously into the edge of the lantern light. They were exactly as Gimli had glimpsed them before, thin and long-limbed, with pale grey skin almost the color of the surrounding stone. Their enormous dark eyes reflected every flicker of flame, giving them an unsettling appearance without suggesting malice. Their hands possessed 6 delicate fingers, each ending in short black claws better suited for climbing rock than for fighting. They wore simple garments woven from some pale fiber that resembled neither wool nor linen. None carried visible weapons. The tallest among them took one careful step forward. It placed both hands against its own chest. Then it slowly lowered its head. The gesture was unmistakably peaceful. Gimli answered in the manner of his own people, lowering the head of his axe until it rested upon the stone floor instead of remaining ready for battle. "We come seeking understanding," he said in the common speech, his deep voice carrying gently through the chamber. The creature watched him without visible recognition. It answered only with a sequence of soft clicks and low musical notes, unlike any language Gimli had ever heard. Another of its companions repeated the sounds, while pointing anxiously toward the darkness beyond the deeper passages. Their movements grew quicker, more urgent, though they never approached within arm's reach. Borin cautiously removed a small piece of dried mushroom from his pack and placed it upon the floor before taking several steps back. The tallest creature stared at the offering for several moments. Then, with astonishing speed, it darted forward, retrieved the food, and retreated to its companions before anyone could react. The others gathered around it, examining the unfamiliar gift with obvious curiosity. One tasted a tiny fragment. Another gave a rapid series of clicks that caused the group to look back toward the dwarves. Their fear had not vanished, but curiosity now struggled against it. Then the mountain shook. The movement was slight at first, little more than a tremor beneath their boots. A second followed immediately. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Somewhere far below came the same terrible roar they had heard across the chasm, only this time it was louder, nearer, and filled with a savage anger that no natural echo could imitate. The pale creatures reacted instantly. Their calm vanished completely. They scattered in every direction, crying out in sharp, clicking calls that bounced frantically through the surrounding halls. The tallest paused only once, turning back toward Gimli. It pointed toward the passage by which the dwarves had entered. Then it pointed toward the deeper tunnels. Finally, with desperate urgency, it swept both hands toward the lower darkness and shook its head violently before disappearing after the others. Gimli understood without sharing a single word of their language. The warning needed no translation. Whatever those hidden people feared was no distant memory. It was still alive beneath the white mountains, and it was coming closer. The echoes of the fleeing creatures lingered only a few moments before the hidden city fell silent once again. Gimli watched the passage into which they had vanished, weighing the warning against every instinct earned through long years beneath mountains. They had not begged for help. They had not threatened the dwarves or attempted to drive them away. They had simply pointed toward the road of safety, and then toward the deeper darkness with unmistakable urgency. Fra looked from the empty passage to Gimli's face. "They fear something far worse than us," he said quietly. Gimli gave a slow nod. "And if they feared us first, that tells us how terrible the other must be." Another tremor rolled beneath their feet, stronger than the first. Fine dust drifted from the great black pillar at the center of the chamber, though the ancient stone itself remained unmoved. Borin quickly examined the floor, expecting to find widening cracks, but none appeared. "The shaking comes from below," he said after a moment. "These halls are carrying the force upward." Gimli stepped toward the carved pillar and rested one hand against its cool surface. The stone vibrated so faintly that only a dwarf could have noticed it. Something enormous was moving somewhere in the depths beneath them. The company withdrew from the circular chamber in disciplined order. No one ran. Panic beneath a mountain had buried many more miners than falling stone alone. Even so, every dwarf felt the growing urgency in his own heart. As they retraced their steps through the broken corridor, Gimli noticed details that had escaped him before. Several of the shattered pillars bore long black stains running across their surfaces. He scraped one gently with the edge of his knife. The substance had hardened until it resembled glossy stone, yet beneath the blade it crumbled into brittle flakes. Fra examined the fragments thoughtfully. "Burned," he said. "Hotter than any forge." Borin looked toward the fractured ceiling. No ordinary fire leaves marks like these. Gimli said nothing, but memories stirred that he would rather have left sleeping. He remembered the blackened halls of Moria after the fall of the Fellowship. He remembered the tales spoken by survivors of the ancient kingdom, describing a terror whose coming had filled the deepest minds with flame and death. Yet he dismissed the thought almost as soon as it arose. Durin's bane had perished upon the peak of Sigil, beneath Gandalf's hand. No second creature of that dreadful kind was known to remain in the West. The scars upon these stones must have another explanation, however unsettling they appeared. They had almost reached the great bridge when Borin abruptly halted and pointed toward the floor. Fresh tracks crossed the dust, hundreds of them. The tiny three-toed impressions overlapped one another in hurried confusion, all leading away from the deeper tunnels toward the upper city. None traveled in the opposite direction. It looked as though an entire community had fled only moments before the dwarves arrived. Gimli crouched to examine them, noting how closely packed they had become. Adults had clearly carried smaller companions, for lighter impressions appeared only at intervals among the larger tracks. Whatever lived beneath the mountain had abandoned its homes with remarkable speed. "They're retreating," Fra murmured. "They're escaping," Borin answered. "And from what?" another guard whispered. The answer came sooner than any of them expected. A distant crash echoed through the darkness beyond the bridge. It was followed by another, then another, each sounding like enormous stones, striking one another far below the earth. The bridge itself trembled beneath their boots. Pebbles skipped across its smooth surface before disappearing into the abyss. Gimli motioned everyone forward at once. "Across," he commanded. "Steadily. No stopping. Look." They crossed in disciplined silence, though every man felt the bridge quiver faintly beneath his feet. Halfway across, Borin glanced into the darkness below and froze for the briefest instant. Gimli followed his gaze. Far beneath the bridge, where only blackness should have remained, a dull crimson glow pulsed once against the stone, then vanished. It was gone so quickly that Gimli almost doubted his own eyes. Borin spoke first. "You saw it?" "I did." "Fire?" "I don't know." Neither dwarf sounded convinced. They reached the far side without incident, yet none relaxed. The clicking voices of the pale folk had disappeared completely. The hidden city felt abandoned in a way it had not before, stripped even of the unseen watchers who had followed the strangers from a cautious distance. The only sounds now were the measured footfalls of the company and, at long intervals, the deep rumble that continued to rise from somewhere beneath the mountain. Gimli disliked the silence. It suggested that every living thing in those forgotten halls had already chosen flight over concealment. Not long afterward, they entered once more the great chamber of pillars where they had first discovered the tiny tracks. Here they found unmistakable proof that the pale folk had indeed made their homes among the abandoned ruins. Small woven sleeping mats lay neatly arranged within sheltered alcoves behind several of the enormous columns. Clay vessels stood beside carefully tended pools of fresh water. Bundles of dried white fungi hung from slender cords stretched between carved hooks in the stone. Everything had been left behind in orderly haste. Nothing was broken. Nothing had been looted. It resembled a village emptied within moments of receiving grave news. Fra slowly lifted one of the clay bowls. "It is still damp." Borin looked at him sharply. "Recently used?" Fra nodded. "Perhaps this very morning." The realization settled heavily upon the company. They had not entered the ruins of a vanished civilization alone. They had walked through the living home of a hidden people whose ancestors had survived unnoticed beneath the White Mountains through all the long centuries since the Elder Days. Those timid watchers were not ghosts guarding forgotten halls. They were the last descendants of the builders, or of those who had inherited their refuge after the city had fallen into silence. Gimli carefully returned the bowl to its place. "No one touches another thing," he said. "They have shown us restraint. We owe them the same." As the company prepared to continue toward the ancient gateway, a faint sound reached them from one of the upper passages. It was not the clicking speech of the pale folk. It was not the deep roar from below. It was the sharp crack of stone breaking. Every dwarf turned at once. High above the avenue, where the smooth wall met the shadowed ceiling, a narrow fissure had opened since their passage only hours earlier. Dust spilled steadily from it. Another crack appeared beside the first, spreading slowly across the polished stone like dark lightning. Gimli watched with growing concern. Whatever force stirred beneath the mountain was no longer confined to the deepest halls. Its movements were beginning to disturb even the upper city. He tightened his grip upon his axe. "We are running out of time," he said. No one disagreed. Somewhere behind them, far below the forgotten city, the mountain answered with another long, terrible roar that rolled upward through the endless darkness, stronger than any that had come before. The roar had scarcely faded before another tremor rippled through the ancient city. This one lasted longer than the others, setting loose a fine rain of dust from the towering pillars and sending faint echoes racing through every deserted avenue. Gimli raised one hand, and the company halted beneath the shelter of a broad stone arch until the shaking ceased. No great collapse followed, yet the mountain no longer possessed the quiet certainty it had held when they first crossed the hidden gates. It felt restless now, as though something buried for countless ages had begun to strain against the weight of the earth itself. Fra looked upward into the darkness where the ceiling vanished from sight. "These halls were built to endure," he said. "If even they begin to fail, whatever stirs below is stronger than I wish to imagine." The company resumed its march toward the upper city, moving more quickly than before, without abandoning caution. Their lanterns cast long shadows across empty dwellings, where the pale folk had left behind woven sleeping mats, clay vessels, and carefully stacked bundles of white fungus. Nothing suggested panic during their flight. Every doorway had been closed neatly. Every tool rested where its owner had last placed it. Gimli found that order strangely moving. Even driven from their homes, these hidden people had not surrendered the habits of careful lives shaped beneath stone. They reminded him of dwarves more than he cared to admit. As they approached the vast chamber of pillars once more, Borin suddenly crouched beside the floor and motioned for silence. Fresh tracks crossed the ancient paving stones, but these did not belong to the pale creatures. They were broader than a wolf's paw, yet unlike any beast known to the company. 3 thick claws marked the front of each print, while a heavy pad had pressed deeply enough into the dust to crack the brittle surface beneath. The stride was remarkably long, suggesting a creature that moved with powerful confidence despite its weight. Gimli knelt beside the nearest impression, laying his gloved hand within it. Even his broad palm failed to cover the mark entirely. "No bear leaves such tracks," Fra murmured. "And no troll," Borin added. Gimli slowly rose. Whatever made these came from below. No one needed further explanation. The trail emerged from the deeper passages, crossed the chamber without hesitation, and vanished into another corridor, leading away from the road the dwarves intended to follow. The creature had not wandered aimlessly. It had moved with purpose. More troubling still, several sets of tiny 3-toed prints overlapped the larger trail before abruptly scattering in every direction. The pale folk had encountered the beast here, and their orderly retreat had become a desperate flight. Gimli studied the disturbed dust for several moments. He saw no signs that anyone had been caught, no blood, no torn garments. Yet the confusion of the tracks alone told enough of the tale. They followed the safer passage toward the bridge, every sense sharpened by the discovery. The silence remained complete until a faint clicking reached them from somewhere high among the pillars. Gimli looked upward and caught sight of a single pale figure clinging effortlessly to the stone nearly 40 feet above the floor. Its enormous dark eyes remained fixed upon the company. The creature gave 3 rapid clicks, paused, then repeated the sound while pointing urgently toward a narrow side passage half concealed behind fallen masonry. Without waiting for any response, it vanished into the shadows overhead. Fra frowned toward the hidden opening. "It wishes us to leave the main road." Borin glanced uneasily at Gimli. "Or it wishes to lead us into a trap." Gimli considered both possibilities. Thus far, the hidden folk had shown fear, but not hostility. They had warned rather than threatened. He trusted actions more than appearances, and every action pointed toward the same conclusion. "We follow," he said quietly. "If they meant us harm, they have had better opportunities than this." The concealed passage proved remarkably narrow compared to the grand avenues of the Forgotten City. Its ceiling descended low enough that even the dwarves occasionally bowed their heads while passing beneath ancient arches. The walls showed signs of more recent use than anything else they had encountered. Small niches had been carved into the stone to hold simple oil lamps fashioned from pale clay. Though none still burned, traces of soot marked the ceilings above them. Here and there lay children's toys carved from smooth white stone, abandoned in the haste of evacuation. Gimli picked up a tiny animal figure, no longer than his thumb, turning it thoughtfully in his hand before placing it exactly where he had found it. The passage twisted through natural caverns before opening unexpectedly onto a broad ledge overlooking another immense chamber. Below stretched what had clearly been the true refuge of the hidden people. Hundreds of small dwellings had been built among ancient ruins, connected by graceful bridges and winding stairways that climbed the stone walls like vines. Gardens of pale mushrooms grew beside carefully tended pools fed by underground streams. Woven baskets, clay ovens, and drying racks stood exactly as their owners had left them. The settlement was completely deserted. Borin slowly removed his helmet. "They've lived here for generations." "For much longer than that," Gimli replied. He studied the weathering upon the oldest structures and estimated that many had stood for centuries. The hidden folk had adapted the abandoned city rather than rebuilding it, preserving the ancient stone while adding only what they required to survive. There was dignity in such restraint. Whoever they were, they had honored the works of those who came before them instead of claiming them as their own. A sharp cry suddenly echoed from somewhere across the empty settlement. It was not the clicking speech they had heard before. It was a scream. High, brief, and filled with unmistakable terror. Before anyone could move, a second cry answered from farther away. Then silence. Gimli was already running. The company descended the nearest stairway with disciplined speed, boots striking the ancient steps in measured rhythm. They crossed 2 narrow bridges, spanning clear streams, and entered the abandoned village just as another tremor shook the chamber. Clay vessels toppled from shelves and shattered upon the stone. A woven basket rolled slowly across an empty walkway before falling into the water below. Still no one could be seen. Then Borin pointed toward the far end of the settlement. Several pale figures burst from a narrow tunnel, running with astonishing speed despite their long limbs. They glanced repeatedly over their shoulders, their clicking cries echoing wildly through the chamber. One stumbled and fell upon the stone bridge crossing the central stream. Before its companions could help it rise, something moved within the darkness of the tunnel behind them. Not the creature itself, only a shadow. It swept briefly across the tunnel mouth, impossibly large, and the stone beneath it seemed to tremble as though struck by enormous weight. The pale folk scattered in panic. Gimli did not hesitate. He drew his axe in one smooth motion and strode forward onto the bridge between the fleeing creatures and the darkness from which the shadow had come. His companions formed beside him without a word. Whatever emerged next would have to pass the sons of Durin first. The bridge seemed suddenly far narrower than it had only moments before. Beneath it, the clear underground stream flowed with deceptive calm, reflecting the lantern light in broken ribbons of gold. Gimli planted his boots firmly upon the ancient stone, his axe resting across one shoulder, while the rest of the company formed a solid line behind him. None spoke. The frightened cries of the pale folk had already faded into distant passages, leaving only the heavy silence before whatever approached from the darkness. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the last. A low rumble drifted from the tunnel ahead, followed by the unmistakable scrape of something immense dragging against stone. Dust trickled steadily from the ceiling. Then two pale yellow eyes appeared beyond the edge of the lantern light, far apart and set much lower than Gimli expected. They did not blaze like fire. They glowed dimly, reflecting the lanterns as the eyes of wolves sometimes reflected moonlight. The creature stepped forward one slow pace, revealing a massive head, covered not in fur, but in rough grey scales, scarred by countless years beneath the mountain. Its jaws opened slightly, exposing rows of uneven teeth better suited to crushing rock than tearing flesh. It continued into the light until its full size became clear. The beast stood higher than two dwarves, placed one upon another, supported by four immensely powerful limbs, ending in broad claws that matched the tracks found earlier. A long, muscular tail swept slowly behind it, striking broken stones aside without apparent effort. Plates of thick, mineral-covered hide protected its shoulders and back so completely that they resembled living rock more than flesh. The creature's nostrils widened as it drew in the scent of the strangers before releasing another deep growl that vibrated through the bridge beneath their feet. Borin swallowed hard. "By Durin," he whispered, "I've never seen its like." Gimli had not seen its like either, though fragments of old tales stirred within his memory. Dwarven legends occasionally spoke of great burrowing beasts that wandered the deepest roots of the world long before the awakening of the younger children. Most dismissed such stories as warnings told to reckless miners. Looking upon the creature now, Gimli wondered whether those old storytellers had remembered more truth than later generations believed. Whatever this beast might be called, it was no servant of Sauron, no troll, and no dragon. It belonged to the deep places of Arda itself, where sunlight had never reached. The creature lowered its head toward the bridge and inhaled once more. Its glowing eyes shifted briefly past Gimli, toward the fleeing pale folk, disappearing into the distance. That single glance revealed more than any scholar's explanation could have done. The hidden people had not exaggerated their fear. They had lived for generations beneath the shadow of this relentless hunter. Yet the beast did not charge at once. Instead, it advanced another careful step, testing the bridge beneath its tremendous weight as though measuring the obstacle before it. Fra leaned close enough for only Gimli to hear. "If we stand here, it cannot pass us easily." "It may not need to," Gimli answered. The old mason frowned. Gimli continued quietly. "Look at the walls." Only then did Fra notice the deep claw marks scoring both sides of the tunnel entrance. The beast had climbed sheer stone countless times before. If denied the bridge, it might simply scale the surrounding rock and descend upon the settlement by another path. Holding the crossing would delay it, but not defeat it. The creature suddenly roared. The sound crashed through the chamber with astonishing force. Several lantern flames flickered violently, and loose stones bounced across the bridge into the stream below. Before the echoes had faded, the beast lunged forward with terrifying speed. Gimli met the charge without yielding an inch. His axe flashed downward in a powerful arc, aimed not at the armored shoulders but at the exposed foreleg, driving the creature onward. Steel struck scales with a shower of sparks. The blow bit only shallowly, yet it forced the beast to twist sideways, slamming its full weight against the ancient parapet instead of directly through the line of dwarves. Borin and the others struck together with disciplined precision rather than wild fury. Spears thrust toward the creature's eyes while axes sought the joints beneath its plated hide. Fra drove the point of his hammer into one heavy claw, forcing the enormous foot back just enough to rob the next charge of its full strength. The beast answered with a sweeping blow of its tail that shattered part of the bridge behind them. Two dwarves stumbled, but regained their footing before falling into the stream. Stone blocks crashed into the water below, sending echoes racing through the abandoned settlement. The fight continued only moments, yet each heartbeat demanded absolute concentration. Gimli quickly realized that killing the creature upon the bridge might be impossible. Its armor turned aside all but the strongest blows, and every wound they managed to inflict bled only sluggishly. The beast itself seemed driven less by rage than relentless instinct. It attacked, withdrew, circled, and attacked again with patient determination, born of countless hunts in the darkness. Between each assault, it repeatedly glanced toward the tunnels where the pale folk had fled. They remained its true quarry. Then Gimli noticed something. Every time the creature shifted its weight, it favored the left side. A long scar crossed the scales behind its shoulder, older than the forgotten city itself by the look of it. The ancient wound had healed badly, leaving one section of armor thinner than the rest. It was the only weakness he had seen since the battle began. He caught Borin's eye. The scar. Borin understood instantly. As the beast gathered itself for another charge, Borin deliberately hurled his lantern toward the opposite wall. The clay vessel shattered in a burst of blazing oil, drawing the creature's gaze for the briefest instant. That heartbeat was enough. Gimli rushed forward beneath the sweeping claws and drove the full weight of his axe into the old scar with every ounce of strength earned through a lifetime beneath the mountains. This time the blade bit deep. The beast bellowed in pain, unlike any sound it had yet made. Dark blood splashed across the bridge as it lurched backward, striking the tunnel wall with enough force to crack solid stone. A shower of rubble thundered down around its head. For several seconds, the creature struggled to free itself from the collapsing entrance. Then instinct overcame anger. It retreated into the darkness with heavy, limping strides, its roar fading gradually into the depths below. No one pursued. Gimli leaned upon his axe, breathing heavily while dust settled through the silent chamber. Around him, the bridge bore fresh cracks, where the struggle had nearly broken it apart. Fra wiped blood from his hammer and looked toward the dark tunnel. "We've driven it away." "For now," Gimli replied. He knew the difference. The beast had not been slain. It had merely been wounded. And wounded hunters often became more dangerous than before. Before anyone could speak again, soft clicking echoed cautiously from the far side of the settlement. Several pale figures emerged from hiding. The tallest among them approached only a few steps before stopping. Slowly, with trembling hands, it bowed its head to Gimli. Then it pointed toward a passage descending still deeper beneath the mountain. Its dark eyes filled with unmistakable sorrow. The meaning was painfully clear. The wounded beast was not the source of the hidden people's suffering. It was only one of many. The pale figure remained motionless with its head bowed, its long hand still pointing toward the descending passage. Around it, others slowly emerged from hiding, until dozens stood silently among the abandoned dwellings, their great dark eyes fixed upon Gimli and his companions. None celebrated the retreat of the wounded beast. Their expressions, as much as their unfamiliar faces allowed, carried only weary resignation. Gimli understood then that this victory had changed little. The hunter would return, as it always had, and the hidden people would once again flee deeper into fear unless something ended the cycle forever. Gimli lowered his axe and stepped toward the tallest of the pale folk. He placed one hand against his own chest before extending it toward the wounded tunnel where the beast had vanished. Then he shook his head and struck the butt of his axe gently against the stone floor. The creature watched him carefully before repeating the gesture in its own fashion, placing both hands upon its breast and bowing once more. It uttered a series of soft clicks, unlike the urgent cries heard before. Though Gimli could not understand the words, he recognized gratitude in the tone. Some truths needed no shared language. The pale guide turned and beckoned for the company to follow. They descended through passages narrower than any yet explored, where the polished roads of the ancient city gradually gave way to rougher tunnels carved by nature. Along the way, the guide paused beside several massive stone barriers that had once sealed branching corridors. Each had been broken inward by tremendous force long ago. Great claw marks scarred their surfaces, while ancient repairs revealed that the hidden folk had struggled for generations to keep those roads closed. Fra rested his hand upon one shattered barrier and sighed heavily. "They were never guarding us from entering," he said. "They were trying to keep something from climbing out." The final passage ended at an enormous cavern whose ceiling vanished into complete darkness. A broad chasm split the floor from wall to wall, and from its depths rose a warm current of air, carrying the sharp scent of minerals and old earth. Across the gulf stood the remains of the greatest gate Gimli had ever seen. Unlike the gateway beneath the glittering caves, this one had not survived the ages. Both colossal doors lay broken upon the ground, shattered into blocks larger than houses. Their carved frames leaned at dangerous angles, crushed by unimaginable violence. Beyond them stretched only blackness, interrupted now and then by faint crimson glows far below that brightened and faded like embers buried beneath ash. The pale guide pointed toward the ruined gate, then toward the wounded tunnel through which the beast had fled. Finally, it swept its arm across the broken stones, scattered everywhere before lowering its head. Gimli needed no translation. Long ago, the ancient builders had sealed these lower roads with all the skill their civilization possessed. Time, relentless strength, or repeated assaults had eventually broken the barriers apart. Since then, the hidden folk had survived only by retreating upward whenever the great hunters rose from the deepest caverns. They had not possessed the strength to rebuild what their ancestors had lost. Borin walked slowly among the fallen stones, examining the shattered hinges and fractured locking mechanisms. His eyes brightened, despite the danger surrounding them. "These gates failed because they stood alone," he said. "But the upper gateway still lives. Its counterweights answer. Its locks still turn." Frár immediately understood his meaning. "If we cannot rebuild this one," Gimli finished the thought, "then we seal the road above it forever." The plan carried painful certainty. It would abandon the lower halls to whatever ancient creatures still wandered there, but it would also restore the barrier protecting both the glittering caves and the hidden people. There was no time to waste. Another distant roar rolled upward through the chasm, joined this time by two more answering calls from unfathomable depths. The wounded beast had returned to its own kind. Gimli felt the vibrations through the soles of his boots before the echoes reached his ears. He turned to the pale guide and pointed firmly toward the upper city, urging the hidden folk to gather everyone they could. Though the words meant nothing, the urgency was plain. Within moments, swift clicking calls spread from watcher to watcher until they disappeared into every surrounding passage. The evacuation began with astonishing discipline. The dwarves hurried back through the ancient city, pausing only where Borin directed them to weaken carefully chosen pillars supporting the old approach to the upper gateway. They did not strike wildly. Every blow followed a deliberate plan, preserving the mountain while preparing a single controlled collapse. Frár measured the stone with the practiced eye of a master builder, correcting younger hands whenever enthusiasm threatened precision. Gimli worked beside them without pause, his axe serving now as a mason's tool rather than a warrior's weapon. Around them, the pale folk streamed quietly toward the safety of the higher halls, carrying children, elders, and what little they could rescue from generations of hidden life. At last they reached the great gateway, beneath the glittering caves. The final groups of the hidden people had already crossed into the upper passage, casting anxious glances behind them. Fundin and the waiting dwarves stared in open astonishment as the strangers emerged from the darkness, but Gimli allowed no time for questions. "Clear the galleries," he commanded. "Every soul beyond the western halls. Now." The authority in his voice swept away confusion. Guards hurried to obey, while Borin and Frár took their places beside the ancient locking wheels one final time. The first roar reached them before the work was finished. It echoed from the forgotten city beyond the gateway, closer than ever before. Heavy impacts followed. One. Then another. Something enormous was climbing toward them through the darkness. Borin turned the first wheel. Deep within the mountain, unseen counterweights awakened. Frár forced the second into place. The immense stone doors shuddered. Gimli seized the third and fourth together with both hands, muscles straining as ancient mechanisms resisted before yielding at last. The fifth followed. Then the sixth. The great doors began to move. Slowly at first, then steadily. As the opening narrowed, a monstrous shape emerged far down the passage. It was not merely the wounded hunter. Behind it came another vast silhouette, then another, their pale eyes reflecting like distant stars in the darkness. None reached the gateway before the ancient slabs met with a thunderous crash that shook the mountain from its roots to its highest peaks. "Now!" Borin shouted. Frár struck the prepared pillar with the full weight of his hammer. The weakened supports failed exactly as planned. An entire section of the passage collapsed behind the sealed gateway. Thousands upon thousands of tons of living mountain thundered downward, burying the ancient entrance beneath an impenetrable wall of stone. Dust filled every gallery, driving the dwarves and the hidden folk alike back into the safety of the glittering caves. The roaring ceased almost instantly, swallowed beneath the weight of the white mountains themselves. Long hours passed before the dust settled enough for anyone to speak comfortably. When the air finally cleared, Gimli stood before the place where the gateway had once been visible. Now only solid rock remained. No crack betrayed the buried doors. No echo hinted at the forgotten city beyond. The hidden people gathered quietly behind him. Their tallest elder stepped forward and placed one of the smooth, white carved discs into Gimli's broad hand. Then, with tears shining in those great dark eyes, the elder bowed deeply. Gimli closed his fingers around the small stone token. He would never know the name of the people who had guarded those forgotten halls through the long ages, nor the true history of the builders whose city had vanished before the kingdoms of men were born. Some stories would remain buried beneath the mountain forever. He found no bitterness in that thought. Not every mystery was meant to be uncovered, and not every road deserved to remain open. In the years that followed, the glittering caves prospered as they always had. The western galleries were abandoned by Gimli's command and sealed behind walls of living stone that no miner was ever permitted to disturb. Those few who knew the truth spoke of it only among the wisest of Durin's folk, and even then with great care. Travelers wondered why one branch of the caves had been closed, despite its promise of further riches. But Gimli answered every question with the same quiet certainty. The mountain has given us all that we need. He never mentioned the buried gates, the hidden city, or the silent people who still lived safely beyond the sealed roads. Some treasures were measured not by gold or gems, but by the dangers one chose to leave undisturbed beneath the endless stone. When you walk through Tolkien's Middle-earth, you soon discover that the greatest victories are rarely won by those who seek glory. They belong, instead, to those who accept burdens that no song will fully celebrate. Gimli entered the forgotten halls because he was a dwarf, and dwarves were made to love the deep places of the earth, to uncover beauty hidden beneath stone, and to preserve what was worthy. Yet his greatest achievement in this tale was not the opening of an ancient gate, but his willingness to close it again. That choice reflects a truth that runs quietly through all of Tolkien's legendarium. Wisdom is measured not only by what you dare to discover, but also by what you refuse to awaken. Some doors become sacred, not because they hide treasure, but because they guard the peace of those who live beyond them. You may notice that no lost kingdom was restored, no forgotten crown reclaimed, and no marvelous power carried back into the sunlight. That is no accident. Again and again, Tolkien showed that the desire to possess every hidden thing often leads to ruin, while humility preserves what pride would destroy. The dwarves were never condemned for loving stone or craftsmanship, just as the elves were not condemned for loving beauty. They faltered only when desire outpaced judgment. Gimli remembers the lessons of Khazad-dûm, and because he remembers, another tragedy is prevented instead of repeated. The past becomes a guide rather than a chain. The hidden people beneath the White Mountains belong naturally to the spaces Tolkien deliberately left unexplored. His world has always felt larger than any single tale, because beyond every mountain there may lie another valley, and beneath every ancient hill there may rest forgotten histories that never reached the songs of elves or the records of Gondor. Such mysteries do not weaken Middle-earth. They strengthen it. You are reminded that the maps in the Red Book never claimed to contain every road or every people, only those whose stories happened to touch the great events of the age. Countless faithful lives continued beyond the edges of those pages, enduring in silence while kingdoms rose and fell above them. There is another thread woven quietly through this story, one that Tolkien returned to throughout his work. The darkness beneath the mountains is never fully conquered by strength alone. The dwarves survive because they choose discipline over panic, restraint over greed, and mercy over suspicion. Gimli listens before he strikes, protects strangers whose names he will never learn, and measures victory not by enemies slain, but by lives preserved. Even the monstrous creatures are not servants of malice in the manner of Sauron. They are ancient beings following the nature of the deep world, dangerous because they exist where light was never meant to rule. In Tolkien's imagination, evil often corrupts what is good, but not every peril is evil, and wisdom lies in knowing the difference. When you leave these halls behind, you return to the same peaceful, glittering caves where the story began. The forges burn warmly once more. Children laugh beneath crystal ceilings, and hammers ring against living stone with patient confidence. Those who pass through the Hornburg see only another thriving dwarven realm, and never suspect how close forgotten darkness once came to its gates. That quiet ignorance is itself a gift, purchased by those willing to bear knowledge without boasting of it. Somewhere beyond walls of unbroken rock, ancient halls remain hidden, while above them, lamps glow softly in the homes of Gimli's people. The mountain keeps its oldest secrets, and the steady sound of honest craftsmanship echoes through the caves exactly as it did on the first, peaceful morning, as though the stone itself has chosen to sleep once more.